Modern sociologists have made some analysis of the function of secret societies in the development of man's modern culture. And while these findings are for the most part based entirely upon cultural factors, they give us some rather interesting information which we can enrich and enlarge through reference to a larger frame of research. First of all, a secret society is usually a group of persons divided from their contemporaries by certain obligations, private assembly, and addiction to a particular or special code of conduct. Such societies began, of course, in the primitive world. Early in the history of man's social experience, tribes, barbaric, primitive, savage, developed secret societies. These were particularly concerned with the over-concept of that time, namely the importance of certain rituals and ceremonies in connection with the building of the individual into his tribal life. All of the important periods of life were marked with ritual, ceremony, and symbol. And the most important of ancient ceremonies of this nature had to do with the concept of citizenship, as it was then understood. By certain trials, obligations, and revelations, the person was prepared to become part of his social order. In tribal times, he received the wisdom of his tribe, and he proved that he was worthy of that wisdom by undergoing certain trials, real or psychological dangers, indicating his heroism, his patience, his willingness to self-sacrifice, his dedication to the same principles which governed his tribal life. After his initiation into the secret societies, he became a full-fledged member of his community. We may therefore say that in this respect, the secret society was also the school, the university, if we may say such, of primitive society. Here the accumulated wisdom of the people was made available to each new generation through ritual and ceremony. At the same time, the secret society bound the person to his spiritual conviction. Through this association, he came to know the deities believed to govern his tribe. He was religiously obligated to the ideals and principles of the tribal faith. All of his political and social instruction suspended from his religious conviction. It was therefore incredible that anyone could pass through these tribal mysteries without becoming strongly convinced of the importance of the religion of his people. In addition to these important factors, the tribe and the tribal mysteries had to do with the genetic problems recognized at that time. Among our southwestern Indians, for example, each pueblo has two sides, and the members of these sides have certain religious obligations and certain tribal rites and ceremonies. Marriage must always be across the pueblo. In other words, marriage must always be into the opposite social group. This was important, as experience had taught that too close intermarriage might prove detrimental to the tribal life. Laws governing conduct were also measured across the pueblo. But in all important matters, the two sides met for conference, consultation, and contemplation of the vital needs of the whole people. Gradually, the secret societies became the virtual custodians of authority, causing the modern sociologists to advance the concept that they were highly autocratic groups. If this may be considered legitimate, it may be pointed out that all life at all times has been a curious blending of autocratic leadership and a democratic state. Any individual who assumes leadership, even with the consent of the governed, gains certain autocratic powers and prerogatives. It was the work of the old secret societies to so enrich the cultural, moral, and spiritual life of the leader that he might not be inclined to pervert his authority or to use his powers to exploit or enslave his peoples. Thus the secret society educated the leader, not merely in the arts and sciences, as we generally consider them, but in the moral values and in the ethical overtones essential to proper government or any executive or responsible position. In the classical world, the secret society took a new form. It became more exclusively the custodian of learning. And we may say that through the classical world, particularly Greece, Egypt, and the Roman Empire, most secret societies were not basically political in their implications. It is true that no individual can refrain from some involvement in politics, especially if he is an informed and conscientious person. It cannot be said that Plato was a politician, nor can it be said that the Platonic dialogues are completely non-political. To the philosopher, politics represents enlightened leadership, and he contributes in every way that he can toward this end. And in periods of despotism or tyranny, his weight is naturally against vested authority which has perverted its privileges. For this reason, many prominent leaders in the religious, philosophical, and cultural life of mankind have been persecuted and even martyred because they have interfered with entrenched political beliefs. During the classical period also, we see the secret society moving behind nearly all forms of generalized education. In Rome, Greece, and Egypt, young people were tutored by professional teachers. After they had received what we might term a broad education, considering the opportunities and knowledge of their day, they were then, for the most part, presented for initiation into one of the secret societies, it being understood that it was the duty of such societies to integrate the person, to give him the associations, the dedications, the consecrations, by means of which his knowledge in any field might be clarified, deepened, and the danger of selfishness or perversion mitigated so far as was possible. This is the general story. And of course, even in the classical period, the overtones remained essentially religious. The secret societies were sanctuaries. Those who entered them were instructed in the true meaning of their faiths, were given certain keys or interior knowledge, and as in Oriental religious societies, they were given certain scientific methods for the advancement of their personal lives, particularly their internal development of resources. The secret society was psychologically symbolic of the internal life of every person. While we live in this world and to a measure of this world, nearly every person has a more or less secret world of his own. This secret world may be no more than a series of convictions, differing from or in advance of popular convictions. The individual who is thoughtful envisions a better world than the one in which he lives. He sees the possibility of man gaining a richer life, developing greater internal securities, and looking around him, he discovers that it is difficult for him to impress these broad convictions upon society. Society is highly dominated by conditioned reflexes, and is the individual attempting to live above or beyond his clan or class tries to spread his convictions, he meets mostly with opposition. He finds, therefore, that it is inconvenient and injudicious merely to approach strangers with his thoughts. His natural instinct is to seek out others of his own kind, binding himself with them, and finding in their association the opportunity for greater self-expression. Thus clubs, groups arise today around certain principles which they feel need or require organized minorities to advance these principles through common effort. If these principles were identical with the common practices, there would be no need for secret assembly. But if these principles are not identical, even though they may be entirely friendly, kindly, non-political, if they are not totally identical with the public mind, then those so interested and so dedicated inevitably form private groups. These private groups advance charities, practice various benevolences, do all that they can to increase the cultural advantage of their members and often of non-members. These kinds of assemblies also were known in antiquity. But in those times, men seldom gathered for trivial purposes. They seldom gathered to meet the simple requirements of the day, inasmuch as society itself, being essentially more simple and having certain natural attitudes, it was not necessary to form special societies to advance the commonplace needs of the people. These societies, then, went after objectives that were not commonplace. We have another group important to consider in the light of the prevailing way of life of ancient man. During the so-called Golden Age of Pericles, and the great Greco-Latin culture. Most countries had their own religions, their own temples, their own sanctuaries, and these religions were state faiths. They were financed by the state and were made available to the people. The citizen of a country in good standing therefore worshipped the gods of his country, defended them, and sought from them such help as he might need. In those days, the general attitude of mankind on religious matters was to the effect that the religion and the state were identical. Any attack against the state was an attack against religion. Any opposition or attack upon religion was an attack upon total society. Therefore, what we commonly call today intersectarian squabbles could not exist. The individual was born and raised within a national or community religion. Because of this factor, he expected other states or communities to have their own faiths. If he journeyed into another area, he generally remained courteous to the deities of that region, and seldom attempted or even contemplated any missionary or evangelical attitude or procedure. It did not occur to him that it was right or proper for him to attempt to change the basic faiths of the nations in which he visited or traveled, nor would he tolerate others coming into his areas and attempting such procedures. It would seem, therefore, that these areas would remain very much isolated and that religious unity would be next to impossible. The appearance, however, has deceived many persons, including scholars. The facts were somewhat different. Behind the state religions of these different areas were always the secret societies. These were composed mostly of scholars, philosophers, sages, travelers, educators, persons whose knowledge of their own religion and the religions of other peoples exceeded that of the average citizen. Therefore, these various faiths, apparently isolated, were bound together by a network of mysteries, or schools of common initiation. And a traveler on the level of the secret society, journeying from Greece to Egypt, found that he was not traveling from one religion to another, but from one interpretation to another. He was therefore constantly reminded that in the core of things, the gods of all these groups were identical deities, known under different names, worshipped with somewhat differing ceremonials, but dedicated to the same principles, and the sciences taught in these different groups were identical, and the arts and the general knowledge were shared by all, regardless. Therefore, Pythagoras, 600 years before the Christian era, traveling throughout the world, visited and was received hospitably and lovingly by over 20 religions, each of which accepted him without question and accepted his knowledge without question. Consequently, the general archetype behind this situation was that the local deities were bound together by a larger interpretation, and that those who entered the secret societies became interreligious in their thinking. For this reason, actual war against any person or group, because of religion primarily, was exceedingly rare, almost unknown. You did not declare war on a man's faith. You might oppose his political structure, which incidentally, of course, included his faith. You might desire his territories. You might seek to gain his wealth, but you did not openly declare war against his God. This was a situation which in many respects resulted in more favorable situations after a period of hostility. When peace was restored, the God concept set in again, and the divisions that might have been otherwise irreconcilable were often mended in this way. Secret societies, therefore, served a great number of purposes and were more widely and generally used than we recognize. In Greece, every free person, man and woman, was entitled to initiation. Consequently, it was not uncommon at the rites of elusive in Attica for 25,000 persons to be initiated at one ceremonial. It was therefore not merely a small group, but the whole of the cultural pattern was invested in these principles. Naturally, there were smaller schools of specialized instruction, and by degrees these schools became trade schools and union schools, protecting arts and crafts, demanding apprenticeships, and our entire concept of the apprenticeship system as a means of advancing skill in an art or science or craft. This arose in the secret societies, for the most common things were so organized. In early England, the tailors had their own secret society. So did the plumbers. Secret societies were not left entirely to abstract speculation. Men had a certain pride in their own achievements and a certain sense of responsibility for the quality of their work. In those days, this responsibility was invested in guilds, and guilds were an outcome of classical secret societies. It was the guild that instructed the apprentice, gave him the choicest secrets of his profession or trade, and bound him with obligations to use this knowledge constructively and honorably. It was therefore a most signal offense against society and God to shoddy the workmanship, to use inferior materials, or in any way to misrepresent a contract. The God concept still occupied the mind of the guild masters. Each meeting of the tailors and the plumbers and the shoemakers and the tinsmiths, each meeting was opened with religious ceremony. Each meeting was closed with prayer. And during the period of these meetings, when matters of common concern, of charity, of taking care of needy or impoverished brethren, whenever these matters were examined, it was in a sanctified atmosphere of dedication, and to each of these guilds, deity represented the peculiar guild master. In other words, of all the shoemakers, God was the great shoemaker. Of all the tinsmiths, God was the great tinsmith. Of all the architects, he was the sovereign architect of the world. To all the physicians, he was the master of healing. Each in his own way, therefore, developed a guild faith, a faith based upon performing his normal human activities, his trade, his profession, as a sacred service, as a dedicated recognition of his responsibility to society. And whatever he did that was useful and helpful to others was a form of religious sacrament. The development, therefore, of great projects with comparative smoothness of procedure marked that time. In a day when great mausoleums, temples, palaces, and tombs required from 50 years to 500 years for their completion. The work proceeded in an orderly manner. It was hardly necessary to inspect the work. The masters of the guilds inspected the work themselves and were more critical than any outsider could possibly have been. Also, they regulated the wages of the workmen. They held the various religious meetings that were necessary. And from this we observe inevitably the rise of a religious spirit, a spirit not directly consistent with the general prevailing orthodoxies of those days, a religion which moved directly into action, a religion which was not drowned in theory, but was constantly vitalized by practice. Thus, religion itself passed through certain modifications. The guild masters did not leave their faiths. Very often they met in the chapels, temples, cathedrals, and churches of their religions. But at the same time, they brought to their religion something previously not so well emphasized, and that was the importance of applying your faith and its principles to the works of your hands, so that each task that was performed was sanctified by the integrity with which it was performed. This type of condition has also drifted down to us in the form of trade unions, in the form of various labor organizations. But little by little, the religious factor has diminished, and these organizations have become protective, essentially, rather than almost completely idealistic. In the religious pattern also, we gradually discover that the decline of the so-called Greco-Latin culture brought with it a gradual motion toward the unification of religion. And of secret societies, we should point out those in which religious rites in areas apart from the natural home of a faith came to be emphasized. The secret societies of early Christendom are at point, and also we should mention the secret societies of the wandering and exiled Jewish minorities. Both of these groups, finding themselves in mostly unfriendly regions, united more and more among themselves in the effort to preserve and maintain their faiths. The secret meetings of Christians in the catacombs under Rome and other such organizations naturally led to the rise of religious societies, where only persons trusted, tested, and tried could be permitted to join the group, for a traitor might have resulted in the death of them all. Thus, the secret society that had originally initiated merely to improve society in general, now initiated to preserve itself, to maintain its own concepts, doctrines, or ideals in a hostile environment. From these rootings, a number of other modifications gradually appeared. After the rise of Christendom, and it passed into a more or less positive relationship with society, the non-Christian minorities, who had once dominated, also found it expedient to organize against the rising power of Christendom. Thus we have a number of fringe organizations preserving their non-Christian identities for centuries after the rise of the church. They accomplished this by the use of the greatest secrecy and with due caution against the possibility of their true projects being discovered. Most of the non-Christian secret societies did not, however, contemplate the overthrow of Christendom. They had no such grandiose idea. What they believed was that they possessed certain knowledge which was not commonly possessed by the members of the new faith, and they therefore united to protect and preserve this knowledge in order that it might not be extinguished. Thus, these societies became protective of certain beliefs or certain attitudes or certain ideas, usually against what they regarded to be the inadequacies of the generally regarded interpretations and procedures. Naturally, these became the heretical sects and were gradually cast off into the darkness and into the wilderness, many of them taking up their refuge in the Near East, particularly in the rising Arabian culture. Here also secret societies arose. And these societies give us another cross-section of our problem. Most religions and abstract philosophical systems that have had broad spheres of influence found it expedient to divide within themselves, or division was more or less pressed upon them by their own members. If society has a majority of conformists who are perfectly content to follow in prevailing patterns, or to worship in an orthodox manner the dominant creeds and faiths of their times, there are always others, mystics, idealists, dreamers, scholars, scientists, philosophers, to whom the prevailing explanations are not sufficient. These persons inevitably seek for greater meaning, and as this meaning approaches the mystical or seeks to substitute internal revelation for tradition, these groups may come in conflict with the prevailing faith. To meet this conflict, they retire into a measure of secrecy. This secrecy serves several ends. First, it prevents outward division in a religion. It prevents a faith from being constantly in the presence of its own heretical followers. Furthermore, it advances to a degree, and rather continuously, the moral and ethical values of a faith. And those ideals which 1,000 years ago were regarded as totally esoteric have gradually come to be new standards of orthodoxy, so that these mystical groups, pressing on beyond the prevailing doctrines, have become the pioneers of progress in nearly every order of society with which they have been associated. This, in brief, perhaps, summarizes the older situation. And it now comes to our mind to analyze the more recent trends in these matters. The first sociological over-concept that develops from all of this is that the secret society represents an organization of the factor of mystery. Anything which is secret becomes a challenge. The moment we learn that there is something folks do not want us to know, we can never rest until we find out what it is. It is the same way with a personal secret. The individual possessing it is overshadowed by the sense of his own importance. The mere fact that he knows something not commonly known gives him a membership in an exclusive aristocracy. He begins to show all the symptoms of this secret knowledge, and usually, unbound by obligation, rushes forth to share it, by so doing gaining a peculiar distinction for being the person from whom this secret knowledge is derived. Thus, there are many kinds of persons. In the field of scholarship, for example, there are scholars who, making a discovery, will die rather than share it with anyone else. There are others who live only in the world of scholarship in order that they may share whatever they learn or discover. Human nature being widely diversified in its temperamental peculiarities, we do learn, however, that mystery exercises an influence far beyond its own proportions. The small child standing in the presence of a dark closet has certain inevitable reactions. This dark closet is powerful. It is almost overwhelming in its potential possibility. A light is then turned on and there is nothing there. But this discovery of the nothingness of the dark closet solves nothing. The next time we are in presence of a dark closet, we go through the same experience again. We are never able to be certain, confident, or positive in our relation to the unknown. Secret societies, consequently, from the beginning, have exercised a strange and wonderful force upon tyrants. They have become, so to say, the reflectors of a man's conscience. The individual who is doing wrong, particularly the popular leader, or the autocrat, or the despot, fears desperately the possibility of the rise of private assembly within his areas. Back in the days of World War I, most of the central powers immediately outlawed secret assembly for fear that it would result in the betrayal of their own purposes. In World War II, both Germany and Italy, under Hitler and Mussolini, outlawed secret societies for fear that from them would rise the force that would later judge them and would make more rapid their overthrow. Also, of course, in all countries now behind the Iron Curtain, secret societies are forbidden, for it is always possible that from them might come the counter-revolutions which are continuously feared. If a secret society does arise within a troubled state, and it is impossible for the police or agents of that state to ferret out the society and destroy it, it then becomes a ghost, haunting forever the tyrant, and causing him to gain greater and greater fear and terror, looking with suspicion upon everyone, hardly daring to accept the closest ministrations of his own family, for fear that they are in league against him. Thus the secret society, as a political instrument, enables a dozen men united together to appear with the strength of 1,000,000. That which is unknown multiplies its power. It is suspected of far more than it possesses, and it also becomes psychologically a judge and juror over the tyrant. It may never move, but its existence in his consciousness may well destroy him. The political power of such organizations, therefore, can, under certain conditions, be extraordinary, especially where the situations permit the continuance of secrecy. In what we call our modern way of life, secrecy, as known in antiquity and during the medieval period, such secrecy is no longer possible. Secrecy today is a highly relative term, and nearly all secret societies are known. The motives for which they stand are known. Their memberships are known. That is, in those nations in which the general way of life does not cause leaders to fear such assembly, or does not give reason to assume that treason is intended, or the destruction of persons, property, or character is likely to follow. This means that in so-called highly advanced nations, nations whose ways of life are comparatively adequate and whose citizens are reasonably contented, your secret societies function mostly as fraternal and benevolent orders, existing as the extensions of old ways, but not presenting any real or major threat to any existing integration of society. Modern societies, therefore, are inclined to advance special ideas, the advancement of which will improve or adjust society, advance education, spiritualize against the prevailing materialism. And in many instances today, so-called secret societies are prime movers toward the recognition of religious value in a time when this seems to be something in strong and desperate need of defense. If, therefore, there is charitable work to be done, if there is need for the strengthening of community ties, if the preservation of a level of consciousness is advanced by society activity, such societies will spring up, preserving part of the forms of older organizations, and perhaps even more of the spirit, but relating mostly to those classical societies which had as their principal aim the general improvement of man, or the protection of arts and sciences, or the service of the needy, or the extension of education towards a higher cultural platform, with emphasis upon the need of man to advance toward the future, better equipped than he is by ordinary methods now prevailing. From such considerations, societies may be regarded as benevolent. This is the way we generally think of them today. And in America today, there are many secret societies, mostly secret because of the membership's conviction that they have a project which would otherwise remain undone, and to which they contribute by means of the slender framework based upon the older concept of assembly for particular purpose within a larger social theater. We think of this and we view the term secret society today as largely so meaning. But let us not forget that our way of life is not as yet the prevailing way of life for human beings. The civilization and culture of Western Europe and America has as yet not touched a comparatively large area of humankind. If, for instance, we may say that we have 2.5 or 2 3/4 billion human beings on earth today, it is also safe to say that better than half of that vast group does not live our way of life, does not enjoy the temporal advantages which we enjoy, nor the personal security, nor the political representation, nor the religious tolerance. Therefore, it is certain that many motives which with us are no longer valid or are no longer sufficiently impressive to bring persons together in private assembly, that such motives do exist in other areas, and that secret societies today, outside of our own sphere of influence, are very powerful and very continuing, and that these societies are for the most part similar in their purposes and objectives as those of Western Europe and America of 300, 400, or 500 years ago. In our way of life, we are not struggling for liberty. We are struggling rather for private freedom. In many countries, however, the struggle for civil liberty goes on against very desperate odds. Many countries are burdened with incredible internal confusion. There are new countries rising up today to attempt their place in the sun with less than 1% literacy.